Hello friends, fellow modelers, and hobby enthusiasts. In this video, I'll show you how I built, customized, and painted a Zaku I model kit from Bandai. This is a 1/144 scale model from the HGUC line, or High Grade Universal Century. Admittedly, a much older high grade release, so features and gimmicks are a little bit dated. Nevertheless, I feel that this kit still has a lot of charm. I really like the aesthetics of the old Zaku I, and it has that retro sci-fi anime aesthetic that I really quite enjoy. When tackling a new Gunpla project that I intend to fully customize and paint, I always like to start by just building the kit straight away. This includes all the initial work you can expect from working on plastic model kits, which includes clipping parts from the sprue or runner, removing the excess gate plastic, trimming away into gate marks, commonly referred to as nib or nub marks, and depending on the quality and age of the kit, a whole lot of sanding. I've made some tutorial videos on tools and basic cleanup work if you're completely new to the hobby, so I highly recommend checking that out first as a jumping off point. Anyways, nothing fancy here. The kit doesn't have too many parts, so I just cut all the parts off the runners and then group them in sections that make sense to me. If you want to cut all the pieces off the runners and clean them all up at once in this way, you absolutely can. I would, however, recommend grouping them via sections following along with the included manual in your kit. Luckily, this kit isn't too large and I can do this pretty easily. Working one operation in a batch like this with all the parts makes the process move along. One new tool I've been trying out on this build is a glass file, more specifically for the gate mark removal process. And I gotta say, I think they're great. Glass files are really nice for making quick work on the nub marks. I wouldn't say it's a total replacement for traditional sanding that I'm used to, but it definitely skips some steps and lets me jump straight to higher grits. This lets me avoid using too coarse of a grit of sandpaper and get smoother results. In most cases, I was able to get away with just trimming the plastic with my hobby nippers and or hobby knife, using the glass file, and then finishing with an 800 grit God hand sponge and up. I was skeptical on using them at first, but after getting in a groove and repeating the process, I felt like I was flying through the initial build. I went ahead and started cementing some parts together, as they have an obvious seam line between these parts that will need to be removed before we can paint. This kit has quite a few of them, and some are particularly tricky, notably on the legs and arms. This will probably need masking to paint later, but nothing too bad. Anyways, I went ahead and sealed up parts of the machine gun, bazooka, Sturmfaust, arms, and shoulder armor using Mr. Cement SP plastic cement. This cement has a quick setting time, so I apply a generous amount through a small gap by placing the two parts close together with enough room to create a channel for the thin glue to flow through via capillary action. Once enough glue is applied, I give a good squeeze and set them aside. After letting those parts dry, I scraped and sanded away the melted plastic and cement squeeze out. Once we prime and paint these pieces later, that seam line should disappear. I also started the first modification to the body. The arms make up three separate pieces: the upper portion, elbow joint, and forearm. Each of these assemblies have seam lines running through and will need to be plastic cemented to remove said seam lines. Simple enough, we can just weld them and sand the glue and melted plastic squeeze out. This, however, complicates the painting process, and blocking in all the right colors will require a lot of masking to get the correct color separation I want. So to minimize masking a bit, I made what's called a C-cut to the elbow joint before we cement the arm parts together. To explain briefly, I'm trimming part of the ringed elbow joint piece that connects to the lower arm by removing a pie slice shaped portion of it with my nippers. This creates a shape that allows the other side enough room to pop back in and out. This allows me to separate the two arm assemblies easily for painting, and it will be easy to just pop back in and reassemble later. The mod itself is also fairly hidden, and the cut is in a non-visible area. It's a very good trick to have in your modeler's utility belt if you have a situation that calls for this. Other cleanup work that was also started was filling some gaps that didn't quite seal flush enough after the initial welding with plastic cement. It was here again that I tried using something new. To fill these gaps, I tried Madworks Black CA glue. This is essentially a super glue, but after curing, sands well at a similar hardness to plastic. The black color also helps with spotting where you're sanding, and so for small gaps, I think it works out. I spot filled any visible gaps with the glue, carefully applying it with a toothpick, and then applied a CA accelerator to speed the curing time. After all the glue had a decent moment to dry, I sanded the area smooth. Another notable modification I tried at this stage was adding some bent detail to the back of the knee joint. To achieve this, I wanted to try cutting zip ties to create some bent details that I can embed into the part. I started by making large rectangular notches with my larger scribing chisels, carefully going back and forth to create a space to drop the bent detail into. After getting the desired depth, I kinda just eyeballed how much zip tie to cut and trimmed it to fit inside the notches. In retrospect, I could have done these a bit cleaner, but it ended up working out nicely regardless. Extra than super glue was used to fix the vent detail in. I widened the vent hole detail with my pin vise, and used a drill bit slightly larger than the initial hole to drill it at a deeper depth, thus making it more pronounced. Panel lines on certain areas became less pronounced after sanding, and some parts had very shallow panel lines to begin with, so with my various size scribing tools, I went over these areas to fix and or deepen some panel lines. And of course, when it comes to carving panel lines, you're gonna have to go over with sanding tools to remove the harsh edges. At this stage, I was admittedly getting a bit carried away with my minor mods, and also getting burned out from all the sanding.
The bazooka, it took so long. I'm so tired, and these arms took so long. They are done. They are ready.
So I decided to snap the Zaku together finally to get a good look at the whole mobile suit assembly after all that initial cleanup. I knew I still had to remove some seam lines on the legs and other minor mods I wanted, but I needed to see how the proportions looked before I could continue my other planned mods. This kit built out of the box looks great, and the included accessories are nice. A pretty nice package. My only gripe is the sticker for the mono eye detail. I would have liked this to be a molded in detail, but for a kit at this price point and age considered, I'm not too surprised and I can't be mad at it. I'll just have to make my own mono eye. As far as other big modifications go, this kit is a bit lacking on the surface details and panel lines, so not only will I be designing and scribing new panel lines, I'll be adding some surface detail with what I have maybe in my parts and Greeblies drawer. I decided to modify the proportions after looking at the model as a whole. At this stage, the Zaku, in my opinion, he's looking a little chunky. Like he's slightly squished. So to counter that, I'll be extending the waist and the upper legs by 2mm each, with layers of styrene sheets cemented in. Before that though, I needed to take care of the seam lines in the legs that I totally didn't forget to do. So these parts got cemented together, which I'll sand down after it fully cures. In the meantime, I did the opposite with the upper torso section of the Zaku. I created a panel line between the two parts to express separation between panels more. To do this, I inserted a small metal ruler between the two pieces and used it to guide my 0.6mm MadWorks panel line chisel on one side all around. The ruler is just there to help me get a cleaner line. You can also just do this with like scribing tape, but I think this method's a little faster. I followed this with a quick sanding of 1000 grit sanding sponge to clean up the rough panel line edges. When you put the two torso pieces together, you can see a fairly pronounced panel line now. The advantage to doing something like this is that it allows you to avoid cementing parts and instead turn it into a surface detail. This is more of a personal aesthetic choice, and it'll be also easier to paint and work with the torso. Following this, I sanded down the now dry leg parts that I cemented earlier to plane away the seam line from the melted plastic and glue squeeze out. Like the other seam lines I did, there were some areas where gaps showed up, so I did another round of spot filling with the black CA glue and gave those parts a spray of accelerator to cure them quickly. I then resanded those seam line areas smooth once again. With the legs now securely sealed, we can now start making those plow plate extensions to add some vertical height. So to help my hobby saw kind of guide its way through there, I used some scribing tape to kind of map out the boundary line of the thighs where I want to make my cut, and create some deep grooves with a chisel all around to create a channel for my hobby saw to grab onto. I'll start by sawing the thighs in half right through the middle on a horizontal axis if the leg was positioned upright. A few moments later, I had the Zaku's thighs cut in half. This is where we'll add height. Now, I know what you're thinking. Did we just do all that work to seal up the legs only to saw it in half again? Yes, the answer is yes. To make my extensions, I just cut a few rough rectangles of styrene slightly larger than the widths of the legs, and applied generous amounts of cement between the layers. These were cemented between the two halves of the legs that I had just cut, and I also took care to align the thighs as best I could before leaving those to dry. Once completely dried, I trimmed away the excess. I repeated this process with the lower torso section by just simply adding layers of styrene to the bottom. Same method as before. Once dried, I trimmed away the excess styrene, and then I went over these areas with copious amounts of sanding and filling with black CA glue in order to preemptively remove any gaps or seam lines that may appear. I also drilled and restored the hole in the lower half to allow the male peg of the waist section to pass through. The male peg connecting to the waist to the torso also needed some extensions to accommodate the new height added to the lower torso. This is a similar process to before, but to add strength and stability to the peg, I drilled a hole through the center of the peg and super glued a brass rod through the center of that hole. After trimming that excess rod off and sanding the newly extended peg clean, You have a pretty strong bond and the added rigidity of that brass rod through the center. After I was satisfied with my cleanup work, I gave the Zaku I another test assembly to have a look at how the slightly altered proportions changed the aesthetics. It's a very subtle change, but it did give the Zaku less chunky proportions. These changes I made at the end of the day are a personal aesthetic choice and totally up to the one making the model. If you're following along and you decide you like the original proportions, that's cool too. Go with what you like. Build the model to your personal taste. Anyways, after what seemed like an eternity of prep work and sanding, I decided that I needed to lay down my first layer of gray primer. I still have modifications I want to do across the kit as well as more extensive scribing work, but the primer at this stage will help me identify any areas where I may have missed or still need to go over. So I disassembled the kit. Before laying down the primer and to make sure we have good adhesion, I washed all the parts first just to remove any residue from handling and any trapped sanding debris. I used my ultrasonic cleaner with a bit of water and just a few drops of dish soap. I ran the parts through a few cycles in the ultrasonic cleaner.
Once it's done, I'm gonna put the ultrasonic cleaner on one side. We're gonna layer the microfiber cloth on one side. And I'm gonna put all the parts down, and then I'm gonna blow them off with my airbrush. Then I'm gonna blast them with my hair dryer just lightly, and then let them air dry for like an hour, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll.
Once I was convinced the parts were thoroughly dry, I began prepping them for paint. There's many ways you can mount parts for easier handling for airbrush painting. The common method you'll normally see is using alligator clips attached to wood skewers. There's also some of the metal variety out there as well, and you can either buy them or make them yourself. The only caveat is that some parts don't really have sections where your alligator clips can grip, so you can implement other things like toothpicks and poster putty to give your alligator clips a graspable area, or just use straight up double-sided tape. Every part is different, so sometimes you have to get creative in order to be able to handle and paint parts. A good rule of thumb is to just grip the part somewhere at a section that doesn't get paint, like a peg or non-visible area of the model. After I managed to get all my parts mounted to their painting handles, I planted them into a sheet of polyethylene foam that I use as a tray to hold all my parts ready for painting. This type of foam is normally used for packing purposes, and the reason I like it so much is that it has a closed cell structure that doesn't crumble like regular styrofoam. So it's essentially mess free, which gives me less things to clean up. I bought these in a pack on eBay and have been using them for years. Just search polyethylene foam if you want these for yourself. You can fit many Gunpla pieces on these 12 by 12 by 1 inch squares, and on most high grades, one tray is really all you need to handle all your painted parts. So with my parts ready, let's head to the spray booth. For priming these parts, I'm going to mix a fresh batch of Mr. Primer Surfacer 1000. I've been using Mr. Hobby primers to paint models for years, and it's my go-to. It's a lacquer primer that grips incredibly well and gives a nice surface for paint to grab onto. I thin them a little more than half and half with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. I highly recommend leveling thinner because it has a retarder agent in it, which slows the drying time just enough to get a smooth painted surface if done correctly. I transfer the contents of the primer bottle using mini funnels and pipettes into 100 milliliter squeeze bottles with a removable nozzle cap. I also add a few glass mixing beads to keep the mixture agitated and blended. Then, using my now empty primer bottle, I fill the bottle with leveling thinner to the lip and then seal the bottle with the cap. I give everything a nice shake in my vortex mixer. You can also shake it by hand, it will just take a little longer. Once I see the inside of the jar start to clean up, I transfer this into the squeeze bottle. I cap the squeeze bottle, make sure it's sealed. I like to use my heat gun to remove the label from the glass jar and transfer it to the squeeze bottle. This is convenient because now I have a ready mixed bottle of primer, clearly labeled. I then airbrush this over all my parts, taking care to get nice coverage by misting on thin coats first, flashing with air, then spraying heavier, faster, and closer. A neutral gray primer is really good at revealing the actual quality of your finish on your parts. It will reveal how well you actually did your prep work. In this case, I'm able to see all the areas where I didn't do enough filling or sanding.
So you can tell after the first round of primers, a lot of spots I missed. We're here, did a hole, around here, around there, especially, see that? A lot of work to be done.
So it's kind of like a gauge on how thorough you are with your surface prep. Despite my efforts to be as thorough as possible, there were numerous areas that still needed attention. Mostly small gaps, holes, and some uneven surfaces. I took this opportunity to test another method of filling gaps that's been making some waves: UV curable resin. Normally this is used in silicone molds for crafts. This is a random brand I bought off Amazon for a past project that I've kind of just had lying around my bench. I wanted to test its effectiveness as a gap filler, so I went ahead and poured some out on a scrap container. I applied it carefully to visible dips with a toothpick and junk paint brushes. I cured the resin with a UV light, then began sanding away the excess resin. I learned pretty quickly that I just made a whole lot of work for myself. I underestimated how hard the dried resin is in contrast to the plastic and super glue. The resin is harder to sand, so it led to some complications getting the surface to the right evenness. Eventually, I switched to my automatic pen sander because my wrist was really beginning to get sore and cramp up. After some patience and a lot more time than I cared for, I was able to get all the parts cleaned up and ready for another round of spraying primer. I thought it best at this stage to start modding the head parts. The kit comes with a sticker for the mono eye detail, which just doesn't work for me. First, we're going to build the frame of the eye lens. To make this, I used some styrene tube that was appropriately sized and just cut a small ring off the tube and sanded that down to a slim ring to fit over the visor part. After marking dead center of the visor, I carefully drilled a small center hole and worked up to larger drill bits gradually so that we can get a clean larger hole to sit within the mono eye ring frame we just made. After some careful reshaping and sanding, I was able to get the frame of the mono eye cemented in and to sit at a nice spot to accommodate the actual clear lens part I'll be using. The inside of the head parts was also trimmed and filed down to allow clearance for the mono eye to turn left and right if I want to change the position. It ended up working out nicely.
Oh yeah.
For the actual lens detail, I'll be using Wave Option Eyes H-Eyes 1 in clear red. You get a variety of sizes with this small sprue, and it was just a matter of kind of eyeballing it and finding the right size to fit. I did have to file the inside of the mono eye frame I just made to get a little more clearance to get the lens piece to fit nice and snug, and eventually I'll glue this in, but I think now would be a good time to shift my focus and start planning the LED to light up the eye. The LED I'll be using for this build is from a company called Evan Designs. They have pretty much everything you need to light up models and the related supplies. I chose a small red 1mm Pico LED, as well as a switch and battery assembly to go with it. Everything comes ready to go, the resistor is already installed, and you can already seal up the connections with shrink tubing. No soldering should be required. This was also foreshadowing for the troubles to come. Now at this stage, I still wasn't sure how I was going to hide the wiring, switch, and battery assembly, as I was mostly improvising and kind of playing it by ear. Anyways, I gave everything a quick assembly with the LED kind of tucked behind the mono eye lens and just twisted the connections together and installed the battery. Turning the switch on, I was like, wow, that looks so cool. I was determined to not only implement this LED, but somehow intuitively hide it within the mobile suit. I kind of racked my brain figuring out how I was going to do this. Ultimately, I came up with a decent plan and settled on hiding the switch and battery compartment in the jetpack. I first needed to make a cutout for the switch itself, so I began trimming away the lower part of the jetpack to make a rectangular space to fit the switch assembly, and a spot to reach the switch to allow it to flip in the on and off position. This wasn't too hard, just some careful measuring and cutting. The battery compartment and adjoining connections and the cables was an entirely different story. To make a super long story short, my heavy gorilla hands ended up breaking some connections. Due to the size, it wasn't easy to fix with shrink tubing alone, so I had to resort to busting out the soldering iron and fixing all the connections I broke.
Yeah, because I broke both of these. Idiots.
In a way, this ended up working out as I was able to reposition and trim the wires in a more intuitive way to run them through the backpack.
My god, that's ugly as sin, but it works.
This to fit in the backpack, I had to completely hollow out the rest of the innards to create a large enough cavity, including the pegs to attach it to this back to get the backpack attachable and removable again. My solution was pretty simple. I used small styrene rods and magnets to create posts with magnets that sit flush on both the backpack and the Zaku's back. This was a little tricky to get to the right height and positioning correct, but once I had everything lined up and glued in, this made the backpack easily removable to be able to change the coin battery. This goes without saying. All this LED nonsense and wiring in the backpack took a very, very long time, and many accompanying headaches trying to figure this out.
Now I'm getting really frustrated.
My determination to get all this to work paid off in the end. After all my struggling and soldering, both the battery assembly and switch sit snug inside the jetpack, and the switch works. The backpack's also magnetized, and it's easily removable if I need to change the coin battery. The wires will be run through some small holes I drilled in the back, which connect to the other wires inside the torso, which then run up to the LED in the head. I did a couple test fits to see how everything was looking and could finally say confidently the LED assembly was good. I masked off the magnets with some liquid mask and used some Tamiya masking tape to mask off all the wiring and the internals of the jetpack to finish off prepping these parts for primer and paint. Plot twist though, when I stepped outside for a coffee, my cat had gone into my build area and chewed on the Commander variant head part, which has that signature protruding shark fin detail thing. It was completely broken off and had little kitty teeth marks. Luckily I'm a modeler and I've learned a few things. I salvaged what was left of the head fin and used a styrene sheet of similar thickness to craft a new fin. It wasn't too difficult. Using pictures from the manual, I was able to cement a piece of styrene to the remaining part and just shape a new fin. I simply took my time and cemented this all together and carefully shaped and sanded the new fin. I think I got it pretty close. On the bright side, having it all cemented in feels more solid. Anyways, after that fun little side quest, it was time to reapply some gray primer, and the head fin looked like it had never been broken off at all. To finish up the head, I also modified the inside of the standard headpiece so it sits better as well. I then embedded a brass rod in the inside of the mono eye assembly directly behind the lens by drilling a hole and using thin super glue to fix it in place. This gives the LED something to be glued to after I paint everything and do my final assembly later. And this also works as a tiny handle I can manipulate with tweezers later to turn the mono eye left and right to change the pose. I gave all the head parts a smooth sanding and then disassembled it back to individual pieces. The clear lens parts were bagged and set aside as I won't be painting that and it will get permanently glued in later. And with that, the head modifications and repairs were done. Since I made a nice lens for the mono eye, I wanted that same level of detail on the scope for the machine gun, as the kit also just gives you a sticker for the lens detail of the scope, and that just won't do. This was super simple. I drilled out the scope section all the way through until hollow with a pin vise and a drill bit that was wide enough for me to drop another wave option eye lens into. Once I was satisfied with the fit, like with the mono eye lens, I'll glue this in later after painting, so I set that aside. At this stage, I went over the entire kit and inspected each piece for any other defects that needed my attention. Almost everything that I initially primed needed some level of sanding again. So I went through, made sure all the surfaces were sanded smooth to at least 800 grit, and then mounted the sanded parts on clips again for another round of primer. And once more, I sprayed primer on the work pieces. Compared to the first round of primer, everything was looking mostly good. There were still a few spots that still needed attention, so I just circled those areas with a pencil and set them aside. I then reworked those pieces through the usual process of filling, sanding, and priming. Although, one thing I did change was to just use Mr. Hobby lacquer putty for any filling needs, as this sands a lot easier than that UV resin I used earlier. I won't lie, this was really starting to feel tedious, and I did have to put the project off for a day and step away to kind of refresh myself. After the third round of primer, I was satisfied. The parts were looking good and ready for the next steps I'd planned. Spoiler alert, there was yet more sanding and priming to come. I want to start by saying, this kit is really nice, but really lacking in surface details due to the age and price point. This is to be expected with an older high-grade kit, but I wanted something akin more to a master grade or real grade level of panel lines and surface details. I also wanted more color separation and a breakup of the various panels. So to achieve this, of course, I'm going to design and carve new panel lines across the entire kit. Making new panel lines is a tedious process, but it's not too complicated when you take your time. Well worth it when done correctly, and the right thought is put into designing them. That being said, I wasn't really sure where to start, so I looked up reference images online of the various appearances of the Zaku I in different media. I settled on a couple cool designs of the Zaku I with some interesting panel lines separating the different sections of the armor. I find that when trying to achieve a certain look, it helps to have reference images to work from. So with my references handy, I began just sketching panel lines, starting with the leg armor freehand with a pencil and eraser right on the gray prime pieces. The primer is matte enough to easily sketch onto with a pencil and easy to erase. The image I was mainly inspired by was a render from the video game Gundam Battle Operation 2. The panel lines look convincing enough where it's practical and serves some kind of mechanical or maintenance purpose. I took my time stopping to mind the symmetry and seeing if my designs just felt right. Once I am happy with my rough sketch, I can begin the process of scribing. Scribing is kind of a nuanced technique and deserves its own whole video, so I won't be able to explain the whole scope of it in detail, but I'll give a quick rundown of my process of creating new panel lines. As you could probably imagine, it's going to be kind of hard to get all the lines clean by just attempting this freehand, so we'll make use of thick tapes to keep our scriber from veering off course. I mostly use high-Q parts scribing tape and Tamiya masking tape for curves. I stick long strips on my cutting mat and use the rulers to cut workable smaller strips. I find that this gives me a lot cleaner pieces of tape to work with as opposed to if I was just going to cut straight off the roll. I use my hobby knife and tweezers to carefully manipulate the workable strips of tape to the edge of my panel lines, working at a small area at a time. I use a combination of my Wave 250 carving needle to start most lines and then varying sizes of panel line chisels to carefully carve those lines in. Starting with light passes first, I can apply slightly more pressure and drag my chisel blade faster, which helps me get a cleaner result. When carving panel lines, it's easy to slip and make mistakes, so I go slowly and make sure grooves are fairly deep, making multiple passes. I try to count the passes so all my lines are around the same depth. This is important as you can go a little overboard. If you do go too far, most slip-ups and mistakes can be cleaned up by just filling with epoxy or lacquer putty and sanding it back down. Needless to say, this was a very time-consuming process. Many hours were spent carefully carving out my sketches and trying to get everything symmetrical and straight. However, once I got in the zone, things sort of seemed to move along, at least for me. Also, one of the trickiest details to make are these small notches, basically super short panel lines like the ones on the lower leg I added to note. Panel lines on Gunpla frequently tend to connect at these 45-degree angles on a variety of surfaces. Connecting those lines cleanly is also really important. I usually don't remove the guide tape until I'm certain the lines are deep enough to not cause my chisel to slip and all my lines are nicely connected. Here's an example of the leg after adding all the custom panel lines. I feel that this process gives the parts a lot more visual interest and is an excellent canvas for when we get to the painting steps. Another easy way I like to add details is by using micro drill bits to drill little holes selectively on certain areas. I try to envision where having rivet holes would make sense, like at a corner to give the impression of it interlocking with an adjoining panel. What this does is give the impression of rivets or screw holes mostly, and I'm not drilling all the way through. I just want a little well that I can run a little panel liner or wash into, a small recess. It's also easy to go overboard and make hundreds of little rivets, but I kept it pretty modest to avoid making the Zaku look too busy. There's also certain tools that can give you different looking holes, like the spin blade from Godhand, just to name names. I don't have any of those special tools at the moment, and for this scale, I think 1 to 2 millimeter drill bits go a long way. I add a handful to the leg armor and various parts of the Zaku just to add a bit of variety. The choice is up to the modeler. I kind of just played it a lot by ear. Anyways, many hours later, I had a lot of new panel lines made across the kit. I also took the opportunity to also add a few more detail at parts. First, I once again made use of zip ties again to add more vent detail to the knee joint. Also, when finishing up the panel lines on the shoulder, I also felt like adding a large vent hole to the front and back faces of the shoulder armor since it was still looking kind of barren. I had these large metal vent hole greeblies that I embedded with super glue into the appropriately sized holes that I drilled into both sides of the shoulder armor. I also created large notches with my larger panel line chisel on the upper half of the shoulder armor and then cemented in rectangular chips of styrene I cut from longer strips to create some interesting raised detail to fit inside the notches. These notches also connect to panel lines, which create some interesting detail, almost like some kind of signal light or pseudo hinge detail. I remember seeing something like this in an issue of Dengeki Hobby magazine or something like that and felt inspired to try it for myself. I think with all that, the shoulder looks pretty nice. Now, I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but this took a very long time. From when I started the build to now, I managed to finish all seasons of The Sopranos playing in my headphones while I grinded away.
I swear on my mother.
That's a whole lot of hours on what I consider initial prep work, and we haven't even started laying down the base colors yet. Finally, after an exorbitant amount of prep work, I finally laid down that final coat of primer. Glorious final coat of primer. Getting to this point always feels super gratifying, like I climbed a mountain to get here. For the paint job, I had a very solid plan. I knew I wanted to keep the feel of the original color scheme from the box art and anime. The issue is that looking at the box art, it's way too simple for what I'm trying to achieve. It's mostly just like blue, green, and gray, which isn't too exciting. My Zaku at this stage, compared to the base kit, is already way more detailed and has more panel line separation. I could do shading to help accentuate each panel, but instead I decided to do no shading and break up the model with multiple tones of blue and green. I feel that when it's painted this way, not only can you pick out all the panel lines and individual panels, but it gives this really nice high contrast look between the different shades, and this is the look I'm going for. I also want the Zaku to be fairly clean looking and to just focus on all the panel lines and vibrant color separation. Something similar to what you would see like in a hobby magazine. It's not normally the style I do, but I think it's important to try new things with each project. I really didn't have enough blues and greens in my stock of paint that were ideal for the Zaku I's vibrant blue and green color scheme, so I mixed my own shades. For the olive green tone, I started with a pretty basic green tone from Tamiya and added varying amounts of yellow, brown, red, and white until I got a shade that was close to the olive green Zaku armor color. I did this gradually and I don't really know the ratios, to be honest. I sort of just eyeballed it and poured and mixed more than I needed just in case.
That's a lot.
Anyways, I did this mixing process until I got 3 shades of an olive green, a dark tone, mid-tone, and a light tone. It took some tweaking, but I felt they contrasted nicely. I repeated this process, but with blue colors instead. Starting with a blue tone I had on hand, I experimented once more with mixing colors, playing with different amounts of blues, red, white, and purple, until I got my dark, mid, and light values for the more violet-leaning blue that you typically see in a Zaku 1.
So that's gonna be my Zaku.
With all my green and blue tones mixed, I went through my paint stock and also selected a few other paints to handle the base colors for the rest of the parts. For the exposed connecting joint parts, inner frame parts, and weapons, I'll be using a combination of two dark steel tones, Zerk gunmetal and light gunmetal, and a dark bluish gray, Tamiya XF50 field blue. Gaia Notes bright gold and star bright gold will be used for certain small details to help accentuate some smaller stuff. Zerk silver will also be used to paint the verniers on the jetpack and a stabilizer for the bazooka. All parts getting metallic paints will need a good glossy black as a base coat to really help with metallic shine, so for this purpose, Tamiya TS51 black, which I decanted from the spray can into squeeze bottles, will be used. I will also be using Gaia Notes Nazca color NC-004 Million Blue for certain small blue details on the armor to bring a grand total tally of 4 different blue tones getting sprayed on this model. I'll also be using this blue for the heat hawk handle. The grenade on the Sturmfaust is also getting painted with Mr. Color 79 Shine Red and Mr. Color 113 RLM04 Yellow. This vibrant color choice is inspired by a concept art of the Sturmfaust I found earlier when searching up reference photos. The manual just shows it as all gray, and I found that pretty boring. After giving it much thought, in order to break up the panels on the armor with different blues and greens, masking will be inevitable. That wasn't too hard to figure out. I mapped out where I wanted the different tones of green and blue to be, and then just kept the mental note. For now, I started laying down colors that didn't require masking. So to start off, I first sprayed down the gloss black base coat for the parts getting metallic paint. I set those parts aside to dry, and then began laying down the first round of base colors. The important thing I had to keep in mind is that when masking later, it's easier to work in a certain order of operations. I like to start by painting the innermost areas first, letting them dry, masking those areas off, and then working my way out. For most cases, this is how I did the paint work, with a few exceptions. Anyways, I went over all the parts, carefully picking out which colors to spray that will optimize the masking process later. I made sure to give the parts a good time to dry and cure before moving on to the next masking step. This is important, as the paint needs to have a really strong bond to the surface. Otherwise, if I apply tape too soon, I risk lifting that paint off when I remove the masking tape later. Anyways, after the first round of colors dried, I began masking each part, going down an assembly line of parts. I use a combination of different sizes of Tamiya standard yellow masking tape, the masking tape for curves, and a liquid mask that you can brush on, Mr. Hobby Masking Soul Neo. The important thing when masking is honestly really taking your time, making clean cuts of tape, and getting those places placed down carefully on your parts. My usual method is just laying down a variety of long strips on my cutting mat and just cutting out little pieces at a time. Having tweezers for this really helps with placement and getting all the tape to the right spot. The Heat Hawk in particular was an example of where I used both tape and liquid mask. Let me give you an example of strategically painting and masking. The Zaku's face, for example, has a vent in the mouth area. To easily paint the recessed vent area, I started by just spraying the vent area of the piece gunmetal and then using little rectangles of masking tape that I carefully applied inside of the mouth to mask off the now gunmetal colored vent. Once I have that masked off, I can easily spray the green for the armor panels, removing the masking tape after drying, and now I'll have a nice color separation between the vent and green armor of the mouthpiece. There's really no rules in order to how to get the masking tape on there and how to get that color separation you need. Some people find it easier to use templates for precise shapes like circles, and that's viable as well. My freshly scribed lines also help as a boundary or guideline to lay my tape down, so all that tedium from scribing is already starting to pay off here. In some cases, you can just lay down masking tape on an area and then use the grooves as a guide for your hobby knife to cut away the excess tape right on the surface. Keep in mind, if you do it in this way, you need to be careful with that hobby knife, as you don't want to scratch up your paint job. I say just use whatever means necessary to achieve that color separation you want. I find that I like to do a combination of masking and hand painting tricks to get to my final results. Masking, no doubt, can be a tedious process, but it's really not too complicated if you take your time and be careful. People always joke that it's 2 hours of masking for only 2 minutes of painting, and honestly, that's super true, but I'm a glutton for punishment, and I like the clean look masking can achieve. Anyways, I eventually got all the parts masked and was ready to spray the next batch of colors. When spraying over masked pieces, I try my best not to be too heavy-handed with the airbrush trigger. There's a chance of bleed through or air pressure lifting up my masking tape, so I spray in mist coats from a further distance and gradually build up that next color. You definitely don't want to flood the piece, as you risk paint going under the tape. I chose my next colors and went over all the pieces I masked. I wish that I could say that it gets more complicated from here, but really the project was starting to lean into that smooth sailing phase. I repeated the process of spraying, masking, removing masking tape, applying masking tape or liquid mask, and then spraying. I think you get the idea. One notable thing I did spray though was a heat effect on the actual blade of the Heat Hawk. I wanted to give the impression of the blade portion having like the cool heat effect, like in the anime when the heat element in the weapon is engaged. So to do this, I masked off the weapon, leaving only the blade area exposed. I airbrushed just like white first as a base to give our colors a bright starting point, and then built up a gradient with red, orange, yellow, and white. Kind of going back and forth. I needed to get a smoother transition between the tones, but I think I got the desired heat effect I wanted. After finishing the Heat Hawk, once I was certain everything was dry and cured, I carefully removed all the masking tape and dried up masking fluid, making sure all my parts were free of any tape or any adhesive residue. Overall, I got about 95% of all the colors blocked in at this point. My masking was mostly good, with a few small exception areas where my masking tape or painting was a little off, but nothing major that I can't easily fix with a little touch up. I was pleased with the paintwork so far. At this stage, there are areas where I felt that it would be easier to paint by hand, plus my recent foray into painting tabletop wargaming minis has got me a little more confident in my hand painting technique. So starting with the Heat Hawk, I carefully block in the energy cables with Tamiya Flat Red, straight from my airbrush ready mixture. When hand painting, it's always better to go in multiple thin layers than it is to go in heavy coats. This will result in a smoother finish with a lot less visible brush strokes. I also take the time at this point to touch up all the green and blue areas where my masking was slightly off by stippling thin layers of the same colors I sprayed. It was mostly areas that my masking was off slightly or areas that got scratched here and there. Again, nothing major, and after touching up everything, you can barely tell it was touched up. I also painted the area around the mono eye lens Tamiya XF85 Rubber Black, which is a flat, super dark gray. It's almost black, but not quite. It's meant to simulate that tire color. I did this so that it breaks up the area even more and to keep the focal point on the actual eye once the head is all assembled. I could have painted it maybe a very dark metallic color, but I like the stark contrast the flat black gives in this area. Moving through the kit, Tamiya Chrome Silver is also used to paint the air hole detail on the shoulder armor. I also continued doing touch-ups as I caught them. Also, to give a cool effect to the verniers on the jetpack, I painted the inside of them carefully with the blue Citadel contrast paint, Ethromatic Blue. Contrast paint has kind of like this inky, transparent property to it, so the recesses will be darker and raised areas will be lighter. Contrast paint is kind of like a colored filter, all over wash like paint that you can just slap on. Depending on what's painted underneath, you can get some interesting effects. I think it looks pretty good as it adds like a little more visual interest to the verniers. Almost like they recently were used and it's like a pseudo heat stain effect from using the thrusters. Pretty cool. I also returned to the lower legs and painted the metal rivets I added earlier with Citadel Liberator Gold. This gold has a kind of like a brass tone to it and I think it looks really nice alongside the green. I load up my brush carefully and stipple the gold color onto the small rivets on the legs and similar details on the machine gun as well. Following this, I painted part of the gun casing Citadel Lead Belcher to break up the monotony of the gray. Looking at the gun after this, I still felt like it was very basic looking, too much dark gray, so I painted the area surrounding the gun barrel a lighter gray, in this case Dawnstone from Citadel. Same as always when layering paint with a brush, I go in multiple thin layers to get smooth and opaque coverage. I also decided to paint the trigger and some other small details on the gun as well with the same gray color. And finally, I painted the area between the barrel and the muzzle area of the gun Citadel Runelord Brass, which is more like a dark copper to my eyes. I think the gun after painting in these areas looks much more interesting now, without looking too busy. Next up for brush painting, the Sturmfaust, which is basically like a grenade boomstick thing, grenade launcher, grenade spear, explosive baton. I'm not really sure, but it looks pretty interesting. So anyways, I loaded up my brush with some lead belcher and picked out this trigger or switch section of the Sturmfaust for a little more color separation. Following this, I also followed the same color scheme I used for the machine gun and basically transplanted that over into the bazooka, since it's already mostly that same dark gray. Starting again with Dawnstone, I blocked in the lower area and then painted the screw and rivet details again with Liberator Gold. There's also this interesting cable detail running through the left side of the bazooka that I began painting with some Citadel Stormhost Silver, focusing first on the connection points of the cable. The cable itself, I think a stark color like Mephiston Red from Citadel would look really cool, so I carefully painted that in, and to finish, I paint the parts of the barrel with Runelord Brass and more Dawnstone to break up those sections. And with that, I think the weapons are looking very good. Obviously, I'm taking creative liberties and just kind of having fun here. My goal isn't really to make an anime-accurate Zaku I. Think of this more like an homage or romanticized take on it from a fanboy. Anyways, the foot area, while not visible unless you literally pick up the model and look at it, has lots of nice details and I just couldn't let myself ignore this area. I decided to just carefully paint in that area by hand. I started by base coating the entire lowered area with Citadel Dawnstone, and then followed up with Citadel Liberator Gold, and carefully picked out all those little vent hole details. Once those were cleanly blocked in, I painted the small rectangular panel towards the heel with Mephiston Red to start breaking up the gray. At this point, after letting those dry, I started applying a black wash using the iconic Citadel shade Nuln Oil. I applied this very selectively to act more like a panel line wash. This isn't an all over wash, as I don't want to put a dark filter or any coffee staining over everything I just painted. I'm just loading up my brush pretty lightly and carefully poking the recesses with the tip of my brush, just the tip. Letting all the shade paint just flow in via capillary action is the key here. The paint straight from the bottle should be thin enough to just flow into those areas. If it's not, then try mixing the bottle well and then maybe thin it with just a touch of water. If I make small mistakes, I can always come back with the previous color and just touch up those areas. Once I've shaded those select areas and given them a considerable amount of time to dry, I began painting the slightly more recessed panels with a very dark Citadel contrast paint called Leviathan Blue. For a contrast paint, this is a pretty strong color. It's almost like a very dark navy blue in my opinion, and a lot more opaque than how a contrast paint should be. So I use it more like an opaque paint and layer in multiple coats to block in these recessed areas a very dark blue. And I quite like the contrast it creates with the cool gray. With the feet done, that wraps up all the brush painting. We're almost at the finish line as far as the paint job goes, and the only thing left I want to do is give all those panel lines I scribed a nice dark black wash and some Waterslide decals across the kit. But before I can do that, I need to spray a gloss coat on all the areas I'll be working on. Since I use a number of different paints with ranges of finishes, spraying a gloss coat will not only unify everything in a gloss, but will seal in the surface we just painted to a nice durable finish. Gloss finish also makes it easier to apply the black wash into the panel lines, it'll flow better, and it also prevents potential coffee staining you risk getting with a more matte surface, so gloss is great. Gloss also make the Waterslide decals really easy to manipulate and apply. It prevents like potential tearing or residue from like excessive decal solution left over, so I like to do a gloss 90% of the time before I do any enamel, panel line fluid, or oil washes. It just depends what kind of look you're going for on your model. Anyways, for my protective gloss coat, I used Alclad 2 Aqua Gloss. This is a solvent-based acrylic, I think. It's definitely not a lacquer or enamel, and it's also not water-based. I'm really not entirely sure, but it's never given me problems, and it dries a really durable gloss finish. Even when I'm spraying a lacquer over it, I haven't had any issues. This type of gloss is usually used to protect chrome. Anyways, as per my usual spraying technique, I always spray the part with light mist coats all around, flash the part with air, and then come back with heavier passes to get a nice even finish. Once I see nice coverage, I move on. It's easy to flood the piece if you go too heavy, so I try to build up that gloss coat carefully. Once I had all my pieces top coated, I let them to dry for 48 hours. They all dried to a nice hard glossy finish. Perfect for the next steps. Now, it's time for one of the most satisfying steps. I'm gonna paint all the panel lines with an oil-based wash from Mr. Hobby. This is Mr. Weathering Color Multi Black. I initially thought this was like an enamel-based wash, like Tamiya panel line accent color, but it's actually oil paint based. Even though they use the same typical like enamel thinners like mineral spirits, lighter fluid, the two paints behave much differently. Oil washes also tend to take longer to fully dry and cure, so you have a longer working time. You can also do a lot of interesting weathering and filtering effects with oil that some enamel paints just can't do. This wash also doesn't seem to be as harsh as enamel-based washes. There's always that risk of weakening Gunpla plastic with enamel thinner and getting cracks, but I'm usually very precise and deliberate where I place my wash and don't flood the piece. Anyways, I make sure to really shake up the bottle so that the whole mixture is nicely blended. I find it easier to transfer a small amount to a tiny metal dish and use my own synthetic round brushes to apply the wash. The process for applying the panel line wash is pretty straightforward. I just load up my brush and dab a bit off so I don't flood my pieces, then just touch the brush to each panel line in a recess where I want a really stark panel line separation. Alternatively, I could use a dark brown or blue, and that would look nice too with this color scheme, but I think I actually prefer the stark black panel lines. That's just my personal preference. For the most part during this process, I just leave the parts on their painting clips and work through the kit all at once. The wash, once completely dried, can be cleaned up easily with a solvent that won't affect any of my other paint or top coat. To clean up the excess once dried, I just use a proprietary thinner for this product, which is Mr. Color, Mr. Weathering Color Solvent. It's really important to let the parts dry for a good few minutes before attempting to do this, as you risk lifting the still wet paint off. For dabbing up the excess wash, I really have taken a liking to using these double-sided gun cleaning swabs. They are tightly wound and don't leave little fibers behind. I just dab the swabs in thinner, roll a bit of the excess off on a paper towel, and carefully wipe away, targeting only the excess wash around the panel lines I just painted. This is a super satisfying process, especially if you've taken the time like I have to really make make a lot of clean panel lines, it's like seeing all that hard work pay off instantly. Anyways, it's a super forgiving process, and if I felt like I didn't apply enough wash to any panel lines, you can easily add more and clean up the excess until you're happy. Overall, great product. No coffee staining or cracks in the plastic, and the smell isn't as harsh. Although I will say you should always work in a well-ventilated area and wear a respirator if possible. Even if it doesn't smell, the fumes can still be bad for your health. Safety first, folks. Eventually, I got all the panel lines done in one afternoon and left the parts to dry for 24 hours. Once I returned to my parts, it was finally time to add some Waterslide decals. Waterslide decals are really great for adding details and a sense of realism to models. Things like caution markings, numbers, emblems, or faction symbols just give it that lived-in look, and when done properly, Waterslide decals have this almost painted-on look. They're also super forgiving to work with if you take your time and apply them delicately. I kind of just browse my stock of decals, just trying to find things that would make sense on a Zaku I, but I also like the look of a bunch of tiny caution markings you would see on a real grade or master grade Verka kit. I grabbed a handful of sheets and just went to town. I wish I could give an exact method of placement to you all, but this is kind of subjective. I sort of use other examples of models by browsing through pictures online and just kind of wing it. My goal here is to ultimately add detail, but I don't want excessive or strange decal placement to kind of make the model look like jarring to the eye, so having reference again really helps. If you haven't done Waterslide decals before, it's super simple. You cut your chosen decal out from the sheet carefully with a hobby knife. I then use my tweezers to pick up the decal and kind of give it a swish in some lukewarm water in a small dish. It shouldn't take much. This will begin to activate the release of the printed marking film from the decal paper. We can then gently slide or coax that decal off directly to where we want that marking to sit. But before that, I like to dab a little mark setter on the underside of the decal. This is a setting solution to help adhere and bond the decal to the surface. I just dip my applicator brush in the solution and then sit it upside down. I pick up the decal away from the release paper and carefully with my tweezers, just touch the underside of the decal to the applicator brush. It's a particularly strong setting solution, so I try not to take too long getting the decal in place. Otherwise, you do risk tearing the decal or have it dissolve in an awkward position, but you should have a good enough working time to get it in position. While that decal is still wet, we can still easily manipulate it with tweezers to the perfect position. If you find that it gets stuck, there's probably not enough moisture, so try dabbing some water under the decal with a brush to get it loose again. But once you're happy with the positioning, it's just a matter of squeezing that excess water out by pressing then rolling back and forth with a cotton swab. We want to make sure there's no air bubbles or any water left, and it's as simple as that for the most part. What I mean really is that decals vary in quality depending on the manufacturer and their age. Some have larger bits of clear film and aren't cut as cleanly. They also vary in thickness, so may need more solution to bond to surfaces. Anyways, there's variables that can make this process more or less frustrating, but it's usually the same process. Just know that not all decals behave the same. There's nuance to this process, just like everything else in the hobby. It's kind of like a hard thing to explain unless you've done a ton of decals. Try doing water slides for a Macross Hasegawa kit or a master grade Verka. Fun stuff. I'm talking about hundreds of tiny little markings here. Anyways, once I finish carefully applying the decals across the kit with Mark Setter, I then apply Mr. Mark Softer, which is another type of decal solution over the decals. What this does is that over time, as it evaporates, it slightly dissolves the film on the decal itself. This is especially helpful to get that decal strongly bonded to the surface. It also helps decals conform to curved or uneven surfaces, or areas where decals sit over panel lines or recesses. It blends them in even further and really helps facilitate that painted on look. Be warned though, Mark Softer is what I would consider a pretty strong decal softening solution. I'm very careful with how I apply it. My method is basically just to wipe the excess off from the applicator brush and then kind of gently brush the decal to let a small pool of softer build up over the decal. I wait a few seconds, then gently touch either cotton swabs or rip little pieces of paper towel to absorb the excess small puddles of Mr. Mark Softer that are still on there. I don't leave any small or large puddles of softer behind. So I take my time to make sure each decal gets the same treatment. There are other brands of decal setting solutions you can get out there. This is just what I like to use. I also find it helpful to have a little tray to hold and separate your wet decals and use decal paper. This is especially helpful for smaller decals as those can get away from you. After a couple hours of applying decals, I was happy with the level of detail I had achieved. My favorite one is the spade on the shoulder. Not sure where this fits in Gundam lore, but I really like how it looks on the pauldron. We're one step away from putting them all back together. Once I have all my decals set and they've had enough ample time to dry, we can finally apply the final top coat. This really unifies all the detailing and paint work I did earlier and allows like all of it to show through. If I had done a paint job with shading, this would also really make the shading stand out more. Still though, the difference of removing any reflections really creates like a cool aesthetic that's great to display on a shelf. It also photographs super nicely. I don't do it on everything though. On parts I want to keep a bright glossy metallic, I just leave those alone. Or if need be, spray another clear gloss to maybe blend in the decals, but I didn't find it necessary. The top coat I went with is Alclad 2 Clear Coat Flat. That's coat with a K. With a K? I don't know. That's the way it's spelled on the bottle. I've been using Alclad 2 products pretty much since I started airbrushing plastic models, and it's kind of like one of my go-tos for top coat. It's a lacquer that dries so smoothly, it really is dead flat and doesn't look chalky like some other flat clear coats I've tried in the past, and it just comes ready to pour and shoot. No thinning necessary. You can probably add a lacquer retarder or leveling thinner to it if desired, but I don't think it needs it. I just make sure the mixture is well blended, and to keep my usual method of spraying, which is, again, just to go over, misting the parts with light passes first, slashing them with air, and then spraying heavier and closer until I get smooth coverage, and then stop. This stuff dries super fast, and seeing those parts turn flat before my eyes is always aesthetically pleasing to see. Once I had finished covering all the flat top coat to the parts I wanted, I left them alone to dry for a full 24 hours before handling them again. When I returned, the parts had cured nicely. We're at the finish line. That's always the best feeling, knowing the next session is the final assembly. I gave them a quick glance and then brought them over to the assembly station. One by one, and with care, I removed each part off their painting clip and began laying out the assemblies one by one. You can see here, I'm wearing gloves just to help protect the paint job just a little longer. I'll tell you right now, and it might be a bit of a hot take, but scratches are inevitable in the finished product of a painted Gunpla. There's so much moving parts and friction, as they are designed to be posable, so expectations need to be managed and some form of compromise is always going to be made, which is like a tough pill to swallow from a perfectionist like me. I try to plan my paint jobs and builds to anticipate this. Every kit is different, so you have to use your best judgment when planning. It's why it's also important to keep paint layers as thin as possible on parts that get hidden and have a lot of friction. This to me is the true crux of building and fully painting Gunpla as opposed to traditional plastic models, as they aren't all static models, and having posable features means movement, which means more friction and parts rubbing off paint. You sort of have to plan intuitively and always anticipate this fact. When I approach the final assembly, it's always with the intention of minimizing scratches when I can help it. Another step I like to do is to give each painted part just a gentle dusting with a soft brush, just to kind of make sure there's no debris or little pieces of fibers or dust on there sticking to the top of the top coat. It's fully dried and hardened already, so I'm not worried about lifting paint. Just some gentle rubbing and brushing. I also removed any masking tape, poster tack, and dried masking fluid still remaining. This kit was now ready for final assembly. I assembled all the limbs, waist, and left the torso and head sections for last, as this will house the LED assembly. After getting all the parts laid out and assembled, I moved on to the torso section. It was just a matter of carefully fishing all the cables through their channels to make sure there's enough slack to still be able to turn the head. Twisting the connecting ends of the cables to their proper partners, I soldered the connections, slipped some small shrink tubing over the connections, and used heat from a lighter to seal them up. The original holes I drilled needed to be widened, as I didn't anticipate the thickness of the shrink tube would add to the cables. After that nonsense was addressed, I had those connections secured, and the cable managed the excess cable into the torso as best I could, leaving a little extra cable for slack behind. I gave the LED one final test to see if my connections were working, so I gave that switch a flip and huzzah! It still lights up. The amount of relief I felt in this moment was crazy. I would have been really sad if it didn't turn on. With that done, and the wiring mostly figured out, I fished the LED through the underside opening on the inner eyepiece and carefully glued the LED to the brass rod I embedded behind the mono eye lens. This was a little tricky, and I kept dropping parts as gluing something this small in such a precise spot was challenging. I also didn't want to apply too much super glue and by mistake and ruin all my hard work, so I really took my time to be careful. After some minor struggling, I did eventually get the LED glue to the correct spot with enough cable running into the torso to give my head just enough room to turn left and right, along with the mono eye itself still being able to turn. I was very pleased with this outcome. With everything in the right spots, I applied a thin super glue and accelerator with thin applicators to fix everything in its right place. I won't lie to you all, I was nervous during this whole process about completely messing this up, but in the end it did end up working out. No visible glue marks and everything is secured. I did spill a bit of thin glue on the black section of the mono eye assembly, but a quick touch up with a flat black by hand fixed that problem right away. I gave the LED one last flip to the on position before putting the head armor pieces on, and was super happy to see that the eye lights up with everything fully assembled. Just as I was ready to celebrate, I forgot about one last feature feature I wanted to implement in the head, just kind of like a clear visor over the mono eye lens assembly. On a lot higher end Zaku models, there would be some kind of clear windshield part over this area. This kit does not come with that detail, so I quickly scratch built one. I started by applying masking tape over the visor area to get an outline of the area I'll need this visor to cover. Mark the edges in pencil, then transfer this to masking tape as a template onto a water bottle. Water bottle plastic is thin and clear, and it's easy to cut with scissors. I'm confident I'll be able to manipulate this in there with no problems. So once I had my clear plastic cutout, I sort of just wedged this over the visor area and assembled the rest of the head pieces around it while trying to hold it in position. This ended up working out super well as I didn't have any issues with fitting and everything is held securely with no gluing required. It was an interesting journey to get here. I did a lot of experimenting and tried a lot of new things. Since I'm building this model for myself, I wanted to see how far I could push my modeling abilities. My goal was to take a high grade and elevate it to an RG real grade level of aesthetics and details. I would say for the most part, I got to that goal. There are a few spots, particularly on joint areas or areas that didn't get a lot of friction from handling or posing that chipped or got scratched, but it doesn't do any disservice to the kit. In fact, it kind of looks like natural weathering or chipping in some ways, so I'm not too bothered by it. Scratches on final assembly are a given. Like I said before, compromises have to be made. Paint jobs have to be planned around reducing the amount of scratches on the final build as best you can. There's no way to fully eliminate it. At the end of the day, you just have to tell yourself when something looks good enough. We are our own worst critics, and it's easy to forget to enjoy this hobby. I definitely enjoyed building this Zaku I. With every build, I always try to find opportunities to sharpen my skills, and there was a lot here that I learned from. It makes me excited for the next project, as each new skill or trick I pick up on is it's like a new sword I need to sharpen and maintain in my armory of modeling know-how. For me, it's about growth, and it's also learning and trying out new things. The experience of encountering all the little curveballs as they come, and then overcoming them is really gratifying as well. It keeps me coming back. What started what I thought would be a quick little project escalated into something a little more. Sometimes that's just what the project calls for. I hope this gave you all a little more insight in my process and how I like to build my models. Your kind words and continued support really means the world to me. I just want to say, as always, stay safe, be nice to each other, build stuff, paint stuff. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Here's the finished Zaku I, aka the Spade.